Coming up, the New York Football Giants and Joe Schoen have restructured Andrew Thomas, converting some money over to a signing bonus and giving a little bit of flexibility. Is there a big move coming for Big Blue? How are they going to adjust to the losses to injury on defense? And maybe even a little talk about Daniel Jones. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we're brought to you by Personam. It's an AI-driven cyber threat detection engine that improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other tools and platforms just can't do. Personam is always vigilant, always learning. Check out personam.ai today. That's PERSONAM.ai. And Andy, just when we thought, we're grinding our way down last preseason game, there's some injuries to talk about on the defensive side where depth is becoming a concern. This is something we hadn't touched on since the beginning of the offseason. Andrew Thomas, contract, the ability maybe to free up some more money for Big Blue if they needed to go make another addition on this roster.
Yeah, it was interesting. It's almost like we forgot that Joe Schoen and the team had a little bit of wiggle room to free up
Maybe they
space.
forgot. We don't know.
We've been hearing from a lot of the people that are the reporters that are closest to the team that are saying don't expect any big moves, nothing big is going to happen. They have the money to be able to operate in season transactional type things. And then all of a sudden we see that they free up, they restructured about 4 million in change. They get about 3 million in change in extra cap space. And it seems interesting, the timing, knowing what we saw on the field. Against the Houston Texans over the weekend, there's probably a couple areas that if the Giants were going to spend money that are areas of concern at this moment. But it's strange twofold because they had plenty more cap space from Andrew Thomas that they could have utilized that they have chosen not to yet. So it's not like they have some big, huge acquisition like a Devontae Adams coming in, but it is interesting timing, and the amount of money feels like it has more questions than answers to me right now.
Yeah, just to give the official, first reported by Field Yates of ESPN, they converted $4.175 million of Thomas's base salary to a signing bonus, which creates $3.34 million in cap space for 2024. The restructure will give the Giants a reported operating salary cap space of about $18 million. Obviously, they've been sitting there just around 10, 11 million, and then all this effective numbers start moving around. Plus, they had the handful of roster cuts. When the offseason started, it felt like they were just at enough, and then things have kind of come and gone. Some other ones we'll get into. At a high level, though, because the initial thing was, it felt like the immediate reaction was, okay, so what's coming? Like, what is this being done in order to get? And it seems like everyone would say, well, cornerback, obviously. It had the depth isn't there. Cordell Flott hasn't been able to be on the field, so you can't really see what it's going to look like. Are you more inclined to think that it is about one singular move that they want to go make, or a narrative that I don't know if it would excite the fan base as much, but I'm a little bit curious on of maybe there's a couple of smart moves they want to make to shore up both sides of the football in a way that maybe is not going to be landing, as we just saw Gilmore signing somewhere else. I don't think there's a $10 million contract coming in the door here in order to improve one key position.
No, I tend to agree with you, Adam. I don't see the big name. I don't see the Xavier Howard type player who is still considered towards the end of their prime that would come in and command reasonably high dollar amounts from a salary range. Yeah, to be honest with you, with some of the injuries and some of the announcements, to me, it may not be the sexy answer that everyone wants, but I could see the Giants making a move for an interior defensive lineman, knowing how thin everything is in that group. And we'll talk about the injuries in a second. That, you sit there and say, well, we have Dexter Lawrence. Like, do we really need to spend more money on the interior of the line? And the answer is yes, because what we talked about on Monday's show was the interior offensive line and the linebacking core is what Shane Bowen really needs in his system to be successful. Yeah. You can't have enough depth there, especially with players getting hurt and injured. The Giants may be looking to make a move across the defensive line. That was where my initial reaction went. What was yours, Adam?
Yeah, well, I mean, and just to highlight, because you mentioned Xavier Howard there, obviously. You talk about a player that's over 31 years old. You have CJ Jackson still out there. He's almost 29. Familiar New York Giant, Adoree Jackson, going to be 29 in mere moments. Like, when you go and look at the free agent market right now for cornerbacks, especially outside cornerback help, like, there are names there. And I'm not, it's interesting because I'm not advocating that any of these names wouldn't be an improvement maybe over the uncertainty the Giants currently have. But I don't think it's the move that you're going to then turn around and say in weeks 2, 3, and 4 and go, thank goodness, because we feel so confident now in the tandem that we have. And by the way, I went over, I want to say maybe with Sports Illustrated, they're listing of top available cornerbacks on the market. I mentioned Adoree Jackson. Jalen Mills, as secondary players in totality, is also listed there. Keon Croson, who was one-time Giant a couple of years ago, is also listed there. Like, it's a pretty bare market in terms of cornerback free agency and secondary help. So my initial thought around, like, hey, would you try to make some of these improvements? The only other thing I could think of we can talk about in a second is, like, is there a trade that the Giants want to try to execute here? But I think you bring up a couple of good points about what's happened to this team from an injury standpoint. Where are some of these holes? And how do the Giants look at it in terms of walking into week number 1 and saying, okay, like, we're ready to go forward here, understanding that we're going to have injuries, as every team does, and we feel confident about the players we have coming in behind them. So coming up here in a second, let's take a look at not only how Andy feels maybe about a trade for a cornerback potentially, but also those injuries that are going on around this roster right now. We'll do that here in just one moment. Andy, I'm a smart guy. And when I tell you that there just isn't a great crop of cornerbacks out there on the free agent market, do you think trade is possible before we talk injuries? Do you think that there could be even one of these? Let's reverse it. We traded away Phillips to the Dallas Cowboys, put in a 7th to get a 6th. Let's reverse engineer. Maybe we're doing something where we end up giving up the higher draft capital and maybe getting a guy that's a margin mover, because when you have cut dates looming, sometimes it's about giving up a little something to make sure that you get your first crack at the guy. Notable that the Giants are the 6th in the waiver wire order when it comes to that.
Yeah, so the Giants have the 6 waiver claims, so I think that makes it a little bit less likely that
Right.
the
Easier
Giants
to
would go
sit.
for a trade just because, there's a few of the bottom teams. Obviously, you talk about teams like the Carolina Panthers and others that have higher waiver claims. But maybe Joe Schoen is operating to say we could take on a little bit more of a salary if someone's looking to start their youth movement and have a salary dump. The only other name I was going to mention on the cornerback
Hmm.
market, and Art Stapleton had pointed this out, is Akella Weatherspoon, who was a
Yes.
cornerback.
Oh, actually, this is the guy that I would jump at. So good on Art. I technically thought of him before Art told me about it, but it doesn't count because now you've said it, so it's over.
You're
But
like,
yeah,
it was in
that's a
my
good name.
brain before he said it, so I stake claim to it. So it's
That's
officially
right.
mine. Credit to me where credit's due. I love it. Did you hurt your arm when you patted yourself on the back
It
there,
was
Adam?
in.
I
I
couldn't
gotta tell you,
tell
I'm a little
how that.
tender, but post
But
podcast, I'll just be icing down, please.
Akella Weatherspoon is interesting. He's 29 years old, so he is on the older side. He's 6'2", 200 pounds. He's a big, long body guy, and the Rams got the most out of him. He was a 64 PFF grade in 2023. Had a dreadful year with the Steelers the previous year, which is
Yeah.
why he's kind of bounced around a little bit. He's kind of hit or miss, but listen, the beggars can't be choosers. The Giants obviously need some help in the secondary. He's a guy that would potentially command more than the veteran minimum. And
Hmm.
so that's just one small name to keep an eye on. Art pointed it out. I've got my radar up looking at it. He's a free agent. He wouldn't cost you wouldn't cost you draft compensation or anything else. Keep an eye on Witherspoon as one of the names to watch.
Yes, again, I did have him on my radar. The weird thing about him is just inside of his numbers, as you mentioned, has had some good runs, especially with the Rams last year. He was targeted 106 times, surrendered just 51 completions, 48% completion percentage for opposing QBs with a 75-7 rating. You know what was the most alarming though that jumped out to me? You go back 3 years ago, 2021, with Pittsburgh, where in more limited action, he only gave up 14 completions on 37 targets. 28.6% missed target percentage and almost 15% this past year. It was one of those things where the height seems really good, right? Because the Giants could use a little more of that size. And then you were like, but I feel like short tackling. And now, again, if you can stop the completion, who cares? But those are some alarming numbers when you see in terms of tackles. But I do like him. And I wonder at 29, up and down, what's the price point? I think that's what really matters here with a lot of these discussions. Okay. The other thing then for us here is what's been going on for the New York Football Giants overall, because they've also been suffering injuries. And you mentioned about, does it make more sense for the team to look at the defensive front? Here's the premise. First, that Ryder Anderson, who had a little bit of buzz to him last year, but never quite came fully to fruition. Then we get the Hard Knocks reference from Shane Bowen. Hey, maybe he could be the guy that steps up in this role. All right, the uncertainty around Azeez Ojulari. But then this offseason, injury here, injury there. And now he's been waived IR, but there is still some chance, Andy, that he comes back around on designated to return, depending on how it shakes out. Bottom line being, you've lost what was perceived to be the next man in line in terms of your depth chart. And in that front, in the defensive front there, you already talked about, got rid of Phillips. Like, we've already thinned this thing out. We all may love Elijah Chapman and his desire to chase down running backs, but the reality is this team lacks experience and certainly lacks some talent in terms of where they thought they would be at the start of the offseason.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Adam, it was a surprise for, not only have we not seen the full effects of Ryder Anderson and what he could be,
Yeah.
but he's been getting a lot of first team reps
Yeah,
throughout
yeah, yeah.
all of training camp. And so the Giants were expecting him to potentially have a role, at least a rotational role. Not, I actually thought his roster spot was not going to be in jeopardy if he ended up making, if he ended up not getting injured.
Mm-hmm.
It's a surprise to see him go. My hypothesis is that
Uh-oh.
his injury is a little bit more than what they're letting on. It may be a 6-8 week kind of
Yeah,
situation.
yeah.
They don't want to burn one of those short IR stints on a guy that is a little bit of a fringe 53 man roster type guy. But Adam, with the emergence of Elijah Chapman, he kind of, starts moving up. Ryder Anderson on many of the depth charts listed, like Our Lads and others, as of yesterday, was listed as a starter for the Giants. So this to me was coming as a surprise. It felt like it caught a lot of people off guard. I mean, you're losing bodies left and right. We're still waiting to hear what's going on with Micah McFadden. That's obviously going to be an important one for the Giants as well. But the
Yeah.
second we start losing these bodies, and you're talking about Jordan Riley, who was active for some of the games that didn't play, Casey Rogers, undrafted free agent, Elijah Chapman, undrafted free agent. It gets very thin very quickly for the Giants when you lose someone like Ryder Anderson.
Oh, of course. And listen, we know we have Nunez Roche. He's going to be there next to with Dexter Lawrence as well. You mentioned Chapman, but then Casey Rogers. I mean, we have our 53-man kind of projection we're going to get into on tomorrow's episode, so be sure to check it out. You mentioned Jordan Riley. He's supposed to be kind of like, oh, okay, we know that we can count on him for X, but whether it's being availability or trusting that the value is going to be there on those reps, that's another interesting point there as well when it comes to how this depth chart is shook out, excuse me. And then a guy like DJ Davidson, who we liked the low level buzz he had last year, but he has not had a great camp or great preseason showings. So there seems to be a lot of uncertainty there. And that's where I wonder about, as these cuts start to come through, will we see the Giants and Joe Schoen start to have that conversation about who are some players that we like? You had as well, you can paraphrase it, but the quote from Joe Schoen about, when we'll look at this more tomorrow, but in terms of, I'll do the paraphrasing. Hey, I actually leave some things about when I talk to my coaches. I tend to leave a handful of more spots open. He says kind of 53, 51, maybe 50, maybe a few more. And I think in this iteration of this team, that's notable because when these cuts start happening, we may be widening 6 to 8 kind of players that potentially could be coming in here.
Yeah, essentially, Joe Shane was asked on the fan, essentially like, how are things working? How do you get down on cuts? And what he said is he asked the coaches to pick their top 22 players on offense and 22 players on defense. And obviously, there's some guys that are specific to
Special
special
teams and
teams,
everything else. Yeah.
like a Gano, like a Casey Kreider, like a Jamie Gillen, and others, maybe even punt return, kick returners, etc. And so when they asked him, like, all right, how many roster spots are up for grabs? It's kind of funny because he said he feels confident in 51. And like as it left his mouth, he kind of like pulled it back. He's like, well, maybe a little less than that. Because I don't think I think he wants to make sure that players are still motivated to try to compete and make these roster spots. I think he probably feels like there's only a handful, like, 2 or 3 roster spots still available and up for grabs right now. And you know what, Adam? It's like at that point, you've seen them all training camp. You've seen a few preseason
Of
games.
course.
There's going to be one more preseason game with third string players playing in it. if you don't have a really good sense of at least like 50 guys on your 53-man roster, then like, what have you been doing the last month and a half anyway? So like, you have to kind of have a number where you're like, I'm confident. And then there's only like a handful of guys that are battling it out, right?
Well, it's funny too. So on that note, because then there's actually a reason why the statement that I want to make that it should alleviate any fan concern about this defensive side and the depth. But on that note, it's so interesting to me about you must feel, and it's not knocking any of these players, but you have to have a pretty low opinion about a lot of the players on the back end of your roster if after an entire summer and training camp and preseason games, you are more eager to go out and grab the discards from other rosters. Now, some of them are established, so you have a track record. You've seen them. Some have connections to an offensive or defense coordinator. We know that. But just the idea that you'd be willing to jettison a handful of players that you've been working with and developing, you have to probably look at their tape and go, boy, this is so bad that I will take a chance on a guy that I may know, but I have not looked at really this entire summer and bring him in off the street to see if he can be ready to go week 1, September, right? Like that's such a, it's just a fascinating way that the NFL works where like the reality of talent hierarchy, it exists in a certain way. And to a certain extent, the off season for, 15-ish players on the roster, it really is just about trying to get reps. We saw 2 rookies get brought in after Ryder Anderson went down. It's just about like bringing in bodies and seeing if somebody catches your eye and maybe fits a role that you have that another team just doesn't have the need for.
Well, but also think about it this way. So we know that Deontay Banks is going to be here. We're hoping that someone's going to be the
Takes him.
cornerback number 2. No one has really asserted themselves on the other outside position. And it's like we've seen what our best capable guys are in terms of Nick McLeod and Cordell Flott and maybe some others.
Yeah.
And it's like some of the guys behind them just haven't run with the opportunity that's been presented with them. Do you go to someone that started 8 games for a playoff team that now is kind of
Oh, of
the
course.
odd man out? Like there's just this idea of like we're talking about a practice squad guy maybe making the back end of the roster,
Yeah.
or another guy on a team that has more depth that actually participated. You're like, well, that guy seems to have a little bit of a higher priority for us in the pecking order. But Adam, as he mentioned, he's already got 51 guys, so we're really talking about like maybe 1 or 2 areas where they would explore someone that is from a completely different roster that they haven't seen before. So that numbers feels small to me. And it should be small. Like you shouldn't be like, we only have 45 guys. We're willing to grab 9 guys that are going to get released from other teams. Then you'd feel like your depth is even in a bigger world of hurt.
Oh yeah, well, so I mean, we'll get into that more tomorrow, but I think that there is more. I think that there is more. I think that Joe Schoen was alluding to the idea that like maybe it is a few more spots than you realize. And by the way, practice squad matters here too, because there's a number of guys on this roster that you like and they flashed a little bit, but the Giants just want to be able to develop them, so that matters here too. One of the key reasons, before I bring up, there was an interesting from Ryan Dunleavy talking about Joe Schoen's negotiations on the Daniel Jones contract, which I was always fun to reflect back on. My one reason to now secondary and cornerback is a separate thing. But in terms of the defensive front, Dexter Lawrence is going to be on the field all the time. Kayvon Thibodeau is going to be on the field all of the time. Brian Burns, Bobby Okereke, like those 4 guys are going to be on the field significantly in terms of rep share. And I think when we talk about the Shane Bone, hey, we go get you Brian Burns, that's what you get, and you don't get upset, and you should be elated by that. I think that no matter how this shakes out, whether it's a veteran X, Y, or Z, I think ultimately that's what the Giants are banking on defensively. That our starters that are going to do the bulk of the work for us, it's about them. If they're healthy and they succeed, hey, we're going to live with the results and mix and match, and maybe a name gets brought into the secondary. I think that's very much on the table. But it's going to be hard to reclimate this depth of that front in any significant way outside of saying, hey, did you like a veteran that you feel like could come and give you at least consistent reps over a player with this upside, but maybe has a down to down kind of pendulum that you just don't want to see swing if you need to take one of those starters off the field?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's not a savior for the Giants' depth that's getting released from another team. That's going out the window. Is there a guy that can make the back end of the roster that in a pinch can play a couple snaps? Sure. But if Kayvon
Yeah.
Thibodeau and Brian Burns go down or Dexter Lawrence goes down, the Giants don't have a player that you get 90 cents on the dollar behind one of those types of players. The Giants will be in a world of hurt defensively if any of their big stars go down. They just don't have the depth that some of these other teams do. Obviously, you're trying to figure out how to complement that depth. And that's really what we're going to be looking at in the last week and a half before they name the 53.
Let's close out here in a moment on a comment and a quote from Joe Schoen, as reported by Ryan Dunleavy, regarding Daniel Jones and the contract. And I think, unfortunately, some context that Giants fans just aren't going to embrace with a warm glow. Coming up here to close out in just one moment. All right, Andy. So there was over on X, and this is coming in. We're recording on Tuesday morning. This was from Ryan Dunleavy. He was reporting about Joe Schoen saying that part of the Daniel Jones agent's selling point to Daniel Jones on the 4-year 160 contract extension was that there are a bunch of other QBs were coming up soon for extensions, and their number wasn't going to be top of the market as it seemed. Quote, "There's not really a middle class of QBs right now. Trust me." That was the sell of the agent at the time. They do their homework too. All these guys are coming up. Context, obviously, was a top 10 paid QB, 40 million a year. When he signed, he is now the 14 to 17 range. What about that in terms of the agent selling Joe Schoen? I'm being like, let me tell you why you're going to want to pay this guy. Because you're going to end up right in the sweet spot when all these other QBs come along. Obviously, results matter and the injuries and the performance and everything else. But there's something weird about that of being like, yeah, well, obviously you're going to want to pay him because it's all going to settle out in the end. And that feels almost like getting sold a lemon at the dealership because while, yeah, middle tier, great. But if you don't have an elite quarterback, you don't have any quarterback. That's the way the NFL is right now. And obviously, when we reflect back, like, quotes like these make me feel like Joe Schoen and John Mayer, not putting on him, but collectively, the franchise wanted this to work out and were willing to be convinced that this was going to make a lot of sense.
So I think of it in two buckets. Obviously, the quote, you're kind of
Buckets.
just like, oh, are we, it doesn't sound
Right.
great. Like, oh, the agent convinced us to do this deal. You're like,
Right.
that
Like,
doesn't
that's,
sound.
yeah. Okay. Just real quick. Like, it's like, oh, the agent convinced you it was a good deal.
Oh,
Like, oh my
he
God.
he told you that there was this type. Oh, okay. So the guy that gets paid on how much Daniel Jones gets paid is the one. Like, great.
Honestly, Joe, it's not about my percentages. It's not about the percentages I make on the contract, but I just think 160 makes a lot of sense to me.
So the problem there,
Oh,
it's twofold. One is the process in which the Giants followed and the
yeah.
logic in which the Giants followed makes sense. If Daniel Jones played margin like better than what he did last year, where it's an unmitigated disaster,
Right. Right.
all of the logic of the process makes sense. The problem was the evaluation of the contract in terms of what Daniel Jones can provide. But
Yeah.
like, if you're saying like 40 million for a franchise quarterback is not that much because the going rate is going to go up, that part was correct. It
Right.
was in fact right. Look at all these players that are getting 50, 52, 55 million dollars. So
Yeah.
like, the way I see it is like the process that they followed to say it's only going to go up. If we want Daniel Jones here, we need to do this now. If we franchise him and he replicates the same deal, like the same season that he just had, it's going to cost us 12 to 13, 14 million dollars more because the market continues to go up. So the
Right.
Giants took the bet at that moment that he was going to continue to progress instead of regress like we just saw. He played horrible, had a terrible knee injury, and before the knee injury, when he played, he wasn't good anyways. So it makes it look so bad. So I don't know if you feel the same way, but like the process that they went through made sense. But then the evaluation ultimately led them to give Daniel Jones the contract, and it hasn't come to fruition yet.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, good process, bad result, right? And it's just, you mentioned the numbers there. And obviously, when you talk about at the top of it right now, AAV with Joe Burrow 55, along with Love, along with Trevor Lawrence now. Like, I think Trevor Lawrence is a good example out there as people have done the comp between Daniel Jones and him and their stats to this point. You go, will you ever have buyer remorse? Guess what? 2 years from now, maybe we'll hear from Trevor Lawrence's agent who was like, hey, I told the Jaguars, listen, guys, when you take a look at the market and people that are coming up, this deal makes sense. Like, I think that there's most of these guys, when you look at those numbers, it adds up. Like, it's like even Tua, okay, the sample size of success is big enough, even if don't prefer. Jared Goff, like Justin Herbert, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, another good example of maybe, hey, did you put too much all in off of a relatively small sample size of success? Sure. The problem is that, like, Daniel Jones sits there just behind Prescott and just behind Matthew Stafford as like the $40 million club. Right behind him is Aaron Rodgers. Right behind him is Derek Carr. Not too far back is Baker Mayfield. And then it's just everybody else. I mean, Geno Smith, good deal, but he's looking for more money now as well. It's like everything else after that, by the way, is flyer guys like Sam Darnold or all the rookie contracts. It's Caleb Williams making almost $10 million and Bryce Young and Jaden Daniels and Drake May. It's like it's all of those dudes now. And that's, again, a reminder of where it lives. And I think to the agent's point and maybe to the landscape of the NFL, at the end of the day, if you are an NFL franchise, you're either paying somebody a ton of money or you're paying a rookie scale. Like that's what it is, right? And like there's a very few instances of in between. And right now, not the only one, but the one that jumps out is the Raiders just named Gardner Minshew their starting quarterback, not because he was the preferred option necessarily. It's where they're at, and they're paying him though $25 million. Like 12.5 million, 25 million total, 12.5 million. That's like the steal in terms of starting quarterback and not having to do significant amount of money on him. And I think when we look back on it, is Daniel Jones was he worth more than 12.5 million a year at the time? Of course he was at the time, but I'd rather it be closer to 12.5 than to 40 or to 50. And that's the difference here.
You know what's funny, and we'll wrap this at the end of the day with the name that you mentioned is Jordan Love being one of the highest paid quarterbacks in the league. And look, they are projecting that Jordan Love will build upon what he has shown. Yeah. But Adam, he had 1 year as a starter. He only started one other game in his career, and that was his rookie season. He completed 64% of his passes.
Of course.
And he was 9-8, but he won a big playoff game, humiliated the Dallas Cowboys. That sounds very familiar to me, where it's like you have one really good year, you finish above 500, you make the playoffs, you go on the road, you have a huge playoff win, and guess what? The team backs up the Brinks truck. And so none of us are criticizing the Green Bay Packers right now because you're like, wow, the process makes sense. If you think you have the guy, the price is only going to go up. The question is going to be, are we going to see Jordan Love take that next step, or is he going to regress? Because all of a sudden, if he regresses similar to what happened to Daniel Jones, everyone's going to look at the Green Bay Packers and say, how could you pay this guy? And so that's the interesting thing is the process that the Packers have gone through was almost identical to what the Giants have gone through with Daniel Jones. But, we'll see what the results end up being if the Packers are going to take that next step.
And guess what? The Packers are known to get guys and have them sit and turn out to be great, right? Like, so track record matters in it. You look at the Packers and Jordan Love and go, it's going to work out. Why? Because it works out for them. Because that's what the Packers do. They only have 3 QBs over the last 40 years of their franchise because it always generally works out for them. So yeah, that's a good watch certainly there as well. And by the way, man, Jordan Love, he threw 83 passes over his first 2 years before he stepped into 2023 and obviously went off for the 32 touchdown, 11 interception season that he did. So, I mean, listen, I love him. And by the way, remember, if anyone recalls, I was the one that said Jordan Love is the man. And then as he waffled early, I waffled as well, but he came back around for me. So
Adam, listen, you got all these spicy takes. You thought about Witherspoon in your mind, so you're gonna plant your flag on that one. You may have said Jordan Love was good, and then you're doing the Skip Bayless where you're giving your backhanded compliment to yourself. Where you're like, I knew it the whole time. I was right initially. Like I should have trusted my evaluation because I'm right so often. And so like, listen,
part of that.
Don't worry. Don't beat yourself up. You were right at the beginning. Don't worry about it.
A big part of it is sometimes when you're right so often, you almost doubt the idea of like, I can't be this good.
Can I be perfect?
Right.
Can I be perfect in all my picks? Or like, is this the one I should move off of? Nope. You know what? Credit to me. I was right the first time. Right?
Exactly. 9 times out of 10, when I flip the coin, it turns up Adam. Now, the bottom line is tomorrow we're going to do our 53-man roster projection. We're going to include the 16 practice squad positions as well. So we're going to break down where at this moment the roster currently stands. And I think we're going to leave ourselves the wiggle room to say, I'm not going to give out every single roster spot because we believe there's going to be some new bodies in here. But I think it's informative, and I'll be curious where Andy and I agree, probably in a lot of spots. But I guarantee you there's going to be no less, Andy, than 5 positions on this roster of significance that you and I will disagree on tomorrow. So that's going to be coming up. You get us on YouTube at One Giant Podcast, on your podcast feeds. We're re-engaging onto all of our platforms. So hopefully you're finding us. Spotify still in the works. Get us on Apple, get us on Amazon, get us on iHeartRadio, get us on Pocket Cast. We're out there on all those. They'll be in the show notes. You can find us there. Links to our platform page as well. And then we come back in tomorrow with roster breakdown, starting to look ahead to the final preseason game and joint practice with those stadium friends, the New York Jets. Until then, though, until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.